and their wonderful families, too. I look forward to working with Secretary LaHood and his very able successor, former Charlotte, North Carolina Mayor Anthony Foxx, to maintain and improve America's transportation systems and networks, the backbone of America's economy. Mr. President, I ask that my next statement be placed in a separate part in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise to speak about the continuing toll of gun violence in America. This past weekend, we lost too many Americans, too many Illinoisans to gunfire. Last Monday, 18-year-old April McDaniel was sitting on her porch in Chicago. A masked gunman in a car opened fire, killing 18-year-old April and wounding 4 of her friends. Last Tuesday, 4 members of the Andrus family in Darien, Illinois, including the family's 2 daughters, aged 16 and 22, were shot to death in an apparent murder-suicide. On Thursday, 19-year-old Robert Allen was killed in a drive-by shooting on the south side of Chicago. And over the weekend, at least 6 people were killed and dozens more wounded in shootings across the Chicagoland area. This senseless violence is devastating, personally to the families involved, but to all of us. Our thoughts and prayers are with these victims and their families. The sad reality is that gun violence continues to be epidemic in America. Over 11,000 Americans are murdered each year. If you count suicides and accidental shootings, the death toll from guns rises to more than 31,000 Americans each year. You know, we've become almost used to this, haven't we? We hear about it every night on the news. We begin to think this is normal. It isn't normal in any other country on earth for so many people to die from the use of firearms. You get the sense of this grim toll by reading the daily gun report by the New York Times columnist Joe Nocera. The report compiles news stories about shootings across the nation. For example, yesterday's gun report describes shootings that took place over this weekend outside of Chicago. A 3-year-old in Columbus, Ohio, and a 4-year-old in Wichita, Kansas, hit by stray bullets. An 18-year-old girl in Iowa accidentally shot and killed by her father on Friday. A 30-minute shooting spree in Omaha, Nebraska on Saturday, leaving 2 dead and 2 critically injured. A 76-year-old man who shot and killed his 75-year-old wife on Saturday in New York after an argument. And a man who walked into a Catholic church in Ogden, Utah and shot his father-in-law in the head during Sunday Mass. These are just a few of the shootings mentioned in that gun report. Each day, the list grows. It is sad. It's appalling. Last Friday marked 6 months since a tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut, when a gunman murdered 20 small children, first graders, and killed 6 educators in the Sandy Hook Elementary School. In the 6 months since that awful day, which we'll never forget, over 5,000 more Americans have been killed by gunfire. The new normal in America. Now I commend my colleagues from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, Richard Blumenthal. They've come to the floor frequently, talked about gun safety and about the tragedy of Newtown and what it meant to them and to the people they represent. We need to listen to them. We can't simply shrug our shoulders and say there's nothing we can do. There is something we can do. There's progress to report when it comes to reducing gun violence. Officials at local and state levels are taking proactive steps that are starting to show results. In Chicago, for example, targeted policing strategies and community-based violence prevention efforts have contributed to a 31% reported decrease in homicides this year compared to last year. The violence of the past week shows that more needs to be done, but the decline in killings is positive news, and I commend the local officials who are working night and day, including Mayor Rahm Emanuel, to do everything they can to reduce gun violence. The General Assembly in Springfield, Illinois, just passed important legislation mandating background checks for private gun sales, something we failed to do on the floor of the Senate. They also require the reporting in my state of lost and stolen guns to law enforcement. That's a minimal requirement, which should be a national law. There are steps that will keep guns out of the hands of criminals and those who are mentally unstable. There are steps that will help reduce crime and save lives. Other states are stepping up as well: Colorado, New York, Maryland, Connecticut. But state action alone isn't sufficient. We need to do our part here in Washington Too often these guns cross state lines. Too often states have weak gun laws next to states with strong gun laws. That's why Congress needs to plug the gaping loopholes in our federal background check system by passing legislation like the bill that was drafted by Senator Joe Manchin, a conservative Democrat from West Virginia, and Senator Patrick Toomey, a conservative Republican from Pennsylvania. Congress also needs to pass a bill with real teeth to crack down on straw purchasing and gun trafficking, a bill that I worked on with Senators Leahy, Collins, Gillibrand, and my colleague from Illinois, Mark Kirk. Members of Congress need to take a stand on the issue of gun safety and gun violence. There should be no more hiding behind these empty, sham reform proposals written by the gun lobby to accomplish nothing. And no more claims that all we need to do is just enforce the laws on the books, because we know that the gun lobby has put loopholes in those laws that you could drive a truck through. I want to mention a few things that Congress should do to help reduce gun violence beyond the two items I mentioned. First, I will introduce legislation to encourage more gun crime tracing by state and local law enforcement. Crime gun tracing is a valuable tool for criminal investigations. When a gun is recovered in a crime, a police department can ask the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, known as ATF, to trace the crime gun back to its first retail sale. This information can help identify criminal suspects and potential gun traffickers. And when all the crime guns in an area are traced, law enforcement can really start to define and identify trafficking patterns. ATF's crime gun tracing system is easy for law enforcement, and it's free. Several years ago, I reached out and challenged all of the law enforcement agencies in Illinois to submit the guns that they had seized in crimes for tracing through the ATF. I'm pleased to report that 388 Illinois agencies are now using the system called E-Trace. But there are still thousands and thousands of law enforcement agencies across America that are not tracing their crime guns. Now, the legislation I'm introducing is called the Crime Gun Tracing Act. It will require law enforcement agencies that apply for federal COPS grants to report how many crime guns they recovered in the last year and how many they submitted for tracing. The bill will then give a preference in COPS grants awards to agencies that traced all the crime guns they recovered. To be clear, law enforcement agencies shouldn't just sit around and wait for a bill to pass before they start tracing crime guns. Tracing brings enormous benefits at virtually no cost. Agencies shouldn't wait for this bill. They ought to start tracing today, if they haven't done so already. But the reality is that many police departments, sheriff's offices, haven't been doing this. My bill will create an incentive for them to start. And let me say something else. The Senate needs to confirm a director to head the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency. For the record, ATF has never had a Senate-confirmed director. The Senate refused to confirm a director under President George W. Bush and to refuse the second proposed director under President Obama. Now a third candidate is being considered. Since the director position began requiring Senate confirmation in 2006, ATF has only had short-term acting directors, temporary leaders. The gun lobby and their friends in the Senate have objected to every nominee, whether from a Republican president or a Democratic president. And it looks like they're preparing to mount an effort to stop the most recent nominee by President Obama, Todd Jones of Minnesota. To be effective and accountable, federal law enforcement agencies need Senate-confirmed leadership. But the gun lobby has done everything it can to keep this agency leaderless and weak. This is beyond hypocritical. After the tragedy in Newtown, Mr. Wayne LaPierre of the National Rifle Association appeared before our Senate Judiciary Committee and said he opposed efforts to close gun loopholes because he said, quote, "We need to enforce the thousands of gun laws that are currently on the books," end of quote. Well, the agency that enforces federal gun laws and refers gun cases for federal prosecution is the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency. In fact, for the last 15 years, there has been a provision written in an appropriation bill called the Gun Lobby Rider that prohibits any of ATF's enforcement functions from being moved to another agency. So the NRA is making sure that the ATF is the only game in town when it comes to enforcing gun laws, and then they're making sure that it never has a permanent director. I want to put the gun lobby on notice. If we can't get a Senate-confirmed director for the ATF, then I'm going to move to repeal the rider and bring in other federal agencies with Senate-confirmed leadership, like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to make sure that gun laws are actually enforced in this country. The National Rifle Association and the gun lobby cannot have it both ways. They can't complain that the gun laws are not being enforced and then stop any effort to put a permanent leader in place at this agency. The gun lobby has to make that choice. If they want to enforce gun laws on the books, they can work with us to confirm a director at the ATF. If they want to keep blocking the ATF from having a director, we'll have to get other agencies involved to make sure laws are enforced. It's just that simple. In closing, I want to again extend my sympathies and prayers to the victims and their families of gun violence. We have to do our part in Washington to put an end to this. We haven't had the votes that we needed yet, but we shouldn't give up. The American people are counting on us to make America safer. Mr. President, I now ask consent that my last statement be placed as a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise to discuss an issue I'd hoped I wouldn't need to bring up today, but unfortunately I do. I'm referring to the continued imprisonment of the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, Yulia Tymoshenko, who's now sat in jail for almost 2 years. In the fall of 2011, Ms. Tymoshenko was imprisoned for a 7-year term on charges that she abused her office in connection with a natural gas contract with Russia. I can't judge the wisdom of that contract, but it's deeply troubling to me is the appearance of selective and politically motivated imprisonment of a former political leader in that democratic nation of Ukraine. Ukraine is a promising, hopeful new member of the community of free market democracies, one with a solid future in the West. It has strong ties to Europe and the United States. This photo shows police officers leading former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko out of the courtroom after the verdict in her case in Kiev on October the 11th, 2011. Ukraine is a great nation. It has helped NATO in Bosnia, Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It's a major contributor to valuable international peacekeeping. It was an early leader in throwing the shackles of the Soviet Union away and declaring its own independence. In 2004, Ms. Tymoshenko and countless other Ukrainians organized a series of historic protests known as the Orange Revolution to address electoral fraud in the presidential election in those days. Ukraine's future is clearly with the community of democracies. That's why the imprisonment of this former prime minister is so troubling. When you're a member of a community of democracies, you don't selectively throw your political opponents in jail for questionable policy decisions. If a poor policy decision was made, let the voters decide at the ballot box. In the neighboring dictatorship of Belarus, where 2010 presidential candidate Mikhail Stakevich, who had the temerity to run against the strongman dictator Viktor Lukashenko, still sits in jail because he challenged the dictator in an election. I might remind my friends in Ukraine, they do not want to be compared with Belarus. They should be democratic. Countless international human rights groups in other countries have decried the charges against Ms. Tymoshenko, calling for her release. The Parliamentary Assembly Council of Europe passed a resolution in January 2012 declaring that the articles under which Ms. Tymoshenko was convicted were overly broad in application and effectively allow for ex post facto criminalization of normal political decision-making. Later that year, both the European Parliament and our very own Senate passed resolutions condemning the sentencing of Ms. Tymoshenko, calling for her release. The European Court of Human Rights, which settles cases of rights abuses after plaintiffs have exhausted appeals in their home country courts, recently considered this case and ruled that Ms. Tymoshenko's pre-trial detention was unlawful, that the lawfulness of her detention had not been properly reviewed, and that her right to liberty had been restricted. She had no possibility to seek compensation for her unlawful deprivation, and that is unacceptable. I truly hope this ruling would finally create the circumstances for a face-saving way out of this mess. Unfortunately, regrettably, it hasn't happened. That's why I've joined my colleagues, Senators Rubio, Boxer, Barrasso, Murphy, and Cardin, introducing a resolution on the matter. It's simple and straightforward, expresses continuing concern about Ms. Tymoshenko's selective and politically motivated detention. Mr. President, let me close by saying I was in Ukraine last year. I met with Prime Minister Azarov and President Yanukovych. They were generous hosts and very kind. They told me something would be done in a positive way about Ms. Tymoshenko's imprisonment. That was a year ago. Nothing has happened. I was optimistic then. I'll remain optimistic. But I want the Ukraine government to know we are going to hold them to the standards of democracy. You don't imprison your political opponents. You beat them in an election, you move on to lead. You're held accountable by the people who vote. I hope the decision will be made in the near future to release Ms. Tymoshenko, and I yield the floor.
Morning business is closed.
The absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
I ask that the calling of the quorum be suspended.
Without objection.
I ask to speak as if in morning business for 7 minutes.
Without objection.
When I closed last night, I posed 9 questions to Secretary Napolitano about the immigration bill. She said when she was going to be confirmed that she would answer questions that Congress put before her. My questions came at the end of her hearing on the immigration bill, and we have not received an answer now in 49 or 50 days, and I'd appreciate answers to those questions. I want to speak about the entry-exit system in the legislation before us. One of the concerns that have been made about the immigration bill before us is that it weakens current law in several areas. Now, when I go to my town meetings, I invariably get somebody saying, we don't need more legislation, just enforce the laws that are on the books. Those very same constituents of mine would probably be really chagrined at the fact that we have legislation before us that would weaken current law. Well, we had a lengthy discussion during the Judiciary Committee markup about provisions dealing with criminal activity and deterring illegal immigration in the future. I found that many existing statutes in this legislation, 1,175 pages, have been revised and watered down, sending exactly the wrong signal that should be sent to the people who seek to intentionally break our laws. The sponsors of the bill have claimed that the bill will make us safer. They insist that the people will, quote unquote, come out of the shadows, thus allowing us to know exactly who is here, where they are, and whether they're national security risk. We've talked a lot about the need for border security in the last week. I think it's the most important thing that we can do for our national security and to protect our sovereignty. Border security is what the people demand. This legislation has weak border security provisions. But amazingly, when I bring up border security, I'm told by proponents of the bill that we don't need to put our entire focus on the border. Well, tell that to the people of grassroots America. These authors remind me that about 40% of the people here illegally are visa overstays, or people that never return to their home country. I don't dispute that 40% figure. And I couldn't agree more that visa overstays need to be dealt with as much as people that are here undocumented who did not come here on a visa. We need to know who is in our country and when they're supposed to depart, and then do they actually leave. We realized this way back in 1996 when we created the entry-exit system. Congress at that time, and still today, under the law, calls for a tracking system to be created. And this followed the first bombing of the World Trade Center. We knew there were gaping holes in our visa system, and that's why the entry-exit system was set up. Now, unfortunately, and for the people of this country, they probably don't believe this, we've had a system, legislation calling for this system to be in place, and it still isn't in place. Administration after administration, and that's Democrat, Republican, now Democrat, dismissed the need to implement an effective entry-exit system, thumbing their nose at the laws on the books. So here we are today, 17 years later, wondering when that system and that mandate from Congress will be achieved. When introduced, the bill before us did nothing to track people who left by land. It did nothing to capture biometrics of foreign nationals who departed. We approved an amendment in committee that made the underlying bill a little bit stronger, but it fell short of current law. Current law says that we should track all people that come and go using biometrics. It says the entry-exit system should be in place at all air, sea, and land ports. We already know that anything less than what is in current law will not be effective. The Government Accountability Office has studied that a biographic exit system like the one set forth in the underlying legislation will only hinder efforts to reliably identify overstays, and that without a biometric exit system, quote, DHS cannot ensure the integrity of the immigration system by identifying and removing those who have overstayed their original period of admissions, a stated goal of U.S. visit, end of quote. If we don't properly track departures, we won't know how many people are overstaying their visas. We won't have any clue of who is in our country. Some will say we can't afford it. Some will say our airports just aren't devised in such a way to capture biometrics before people board airplanes. They will find any excuse not to implement current law, and that's why this current law hasn't been executed in the last 17 years. This is a border security issue. It's a national security issue. Without this system in place, we aren't in control of our immigration system. Senator Vitter's amendment, which is pending, would ensure that the current law is met before we legalize millions of people. I encourage my colleagues to really understand how this bill weakens our ability to protect the homeland, and I also encourage the adoption of the Vitter amendment when we vote at 3 o'clock. I yield the floor.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-744, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 80, S-744, a bill to provide for comprehensive immigration reform and for other purposes.
President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I'm encouraged that later today the Senate will vote on 4 amendments to the immigration bill. I hope it's an indication the Senate is going to begin considering amendments in an orderly and efficient way. Now, I would encourage senators to file their amendments, come to the floor, and offer them. I share the majority leader's wish to make progress on this important legislation. We know the immigration system is sorely in need of reform, and now's the time to do it. Last week, we should have disposed of several amendments to the bill before us, but in the Senate, progress requires cooperation. Instead of going forward and actually having senators take positions, vote up or down, we had objection after objection from the opponents to this legislation, who put the Senate in an unenviable position of having the public see us as voting maybe. You know, we know why people get discouraged with Congress. They don't realize there's a small number of people blocking any voting. They expect us to vote for or against something. Now, there's going to be political costs voting for or voting against, but they expect you to do that. It comes with a job. And when people object to proceeding to comprehensive immigration reform, that costs us several days. Again, the American public sees the U.S. Senate as voting maybe. Well, I'm one senator willing to take the consequences of voting for or against something and not voting maybe. I think most senators would prefer voting yes or no and not maybe. In fact, when we finally ended the filibuster and were able to vote to proceed the bill, 84 senators stood up and said, let's proceed. They voted in favor of doing so. Now, they know they're going to risk some criticism from some for doing that, but at least they had the courage to do it. We still have a tiny handful that keep on trying to say, vote maybe. It is frustrating because that initial delay was not necessary. It didn't add to the debate. It simply hindered the Senate's consideration of the bill. In fact, opponents of the bipartisan legislation have even objected to adoption of the Judiciary Committee's substitute, despite widespread praise from both Republicans and Democrats for how we conducted our proceedings and our overwhelming bipartisan vote to get the bill to the full Senate. You know, this was a bill where all the amendments made to it, almost all of them were in a bipartisan vote. We had 40-some-odd amendments offered by Republicans that were accepted by both Republicans and Democrats. So the votes against even proceeding to this bill indicate that at least 15 members of the minority are so dug in against comprehensive immigration reform they are unalterably opposed. They want us to vote maybe, to duck the issue. They vote against the Senate even taking up the issue. They want to duck the issue. Well, that's not a profile in courage. And those few senators should not further obstruct the 84 senators who appear ready to go to work on this bill and vote for or against it. So the question is whether the other members of the Republican Party will follow those who seek to delay the Senate's consideration or whether they'll work with us to pass a good bill. More than 100 amendments have been filed to the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill, but over the last 2 weeks we've only voted once on the motion to table an amendment that had already been defeated in committee. Now, I began this process in a spirit of cooperation. I offered an amendment on behalf of myself and Senator Hatch, the senior member of the Republican Party, to strengthen our visa program for visiting foreign artists who come to perform with nonprofit arts organizations. I was then, following the procedures and the cooperation that I've known here for decades in the Senate, I was willing to give consent to Senator Grassley to set aside my amendment and offer his amendment relating to border security. Unfortunately, when we asked for the same courtesy so that other senators, Republicans and Democrats alike, could call up additional amendments, there was an objection. In other words, we're expected to, and I was expected to cooperate and follow this normal procedure, but the second we asked for the other side to do that, oh no, can't do it. The rules have to be different. Then when the Majority Leader offered a unanimous consent request to have votes on Senator Grassley's amendment and others in a manner that Senate Republicans, including the Senate Republican leader just a few days ago, have been insisting on with respect to amendments and legislation and nominations, the minority objected. Then when the Majority Leader asked a group of amendments offered by senators on both sides of the aisle be allowed to be offered, again there's an objection. So it's with great effort that we're trying to work through amendments. But like the minority's treatment of nominations, even consensus amendments are being objected to and delayed. We've been unable to get an amendment by the Republican senator from Nevada pending because there is Republican objection to a Republican senator's offering an amendment which is probably going to pass with overwhelming support from both Republicans and Democrats. So it's no wonder the public approval of Congress in last week's Gallup poll fell to just 10%. A time when so many Americans are in favor of reforming the nation's broken immigration system, we in the Senate should be working together to meet that demand and reflect what the people of America want. The President spoke again last week about immigration reform and what's needed. The President had with him a broad cross-section of those supporting our efforts, from business and labor and law enforcement, clergy, people from both sides of the aisle. Just as I worked with President Bush in 2006 when he supported comprehensive immigration reform, I urge Senate Republicans to work with us now. Senators from both sides of the aisle work together to develop this legislation. Senators from both sides of the aisle. Then senators from the Judiciary Committee considered it. We adopted more than 130 amendments to improve it, almost all of them with a bipartisan vote. And then senators from both sides of the aisle now need to come together to defeat debilitating amendments and pass the legislation. We had amendment, we finally had a vote, a tabling vote on my friend from Iowa's amendment. But I note that it was tabled by a bipartisan majority of 57 votes. 5 Republicans also voted to table it. And of course, this was an amendment, as most people knew on the floor, had been considered by the Judiciary Committee. It was defeated there by a bipartisan vote of 2/3 of the committee. It would have undermined and unfairly preempted the pathway to earn citizenship. It would have made the fates of millions seeking to come out of the shadows and join American life unfairly dependent on circumstances way beyond any control they might have. So I'm troubled by proposals that contain false promises in which we promise citizenship, but it's always over the next mountain. We're going to give you citizenship, but not quite yet. It's almost like Sisyphus in pushing that rock up the hill. I want the pathway to be clear and the goal of citizenship attainable. It can't be rigged by some elusive precondition. We should treat people fairly, not have their fates determined by matters beyond their control. No undocumented American controls the border or is responsible for its security. The things that are being set up to kill this bill would have blocked my grandparents from coming to Vermont from Italy. It would have blocked the parents and grandparents of many of the senators now serving in the United States Senate. So I don't want people to move out of the shadows only to be stuck in some underclass. Just as we should not fault the dreamers who were brought here as children, we should not make people's fates and future status dependent on border enforcement conditions over which they have no control. This legislation is far too important to be subject to needless delay. And I hope the vote today signal an end to the delay we've experienced until this point. We should have a healthy, a vigorous debate on the Judiciary Committee's reported bill. Central to that debate is considering and voting on amendments. You know, one of the bright moments in American public's view of the Senate was the way Republicans and Democrats alike worked in the Senate Judiciary Committee to get this bill before us. A public debate was followed online by millions of people. We brought up amendments, we debated them, and then we voted on them. Nobody voted maybe. They voted yes and they voted no. The American public responded overwhelmingly, saying this was the way to go, and I think Republicans and Democrats on the floor justly praised the way it was done in the Judiciary Committee. But shouldn't we do that? That was 18 of us working, and I compliment the distinguished senator from Iowa for his work, even though we disagreed on the outcome of it. We worked together to get that debate finished. We went into the evenings. We worked all day over a couple of weeks, and we got it done. But now all 100 of us should stand here and do the same thing. And demands for different voting standards for Republican and Democratic amendments are wrong. A couple of weeks ago, the distinguished Republican leader spoke at an event. I was sitting there. He knew I was following him to speak, and he said, on matters this important, all the amendments should be 60-vote amendments. Well, I've had a different view in the past, but I said, okay, then we'll do that for both Democrats and Republicans. But let's get it done. But having different standards for Republicans and Democrats is not how the Judiciary Committee considers this legislation. But it's also not how the majority of Americans expect us to conduct the debate. The tactics of last week undermined the Senate's work on this important bill. Those who have already decided to oppose this bill at the end of the Senate's consideration, well, then vote against it. But don't dictate the work of 84 senators who are ready to go forward and vote. So I call on all senators, please file your amendments to this bipartisan legislation by Thursday and work with us, if need be, on Friday and Saturday and through the weekend, so we can make much-needed progress in this legislation without further delay. Mr. President, is there a division of time?
The time is equally divided.
Mr. President, I reserve the balance of my time.
Without objection.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
I would yield 10 minutes of my time to Senator Thune.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I think we all agree that our immigration system is broken and that it needs to be fixed. Unfortunately, every time Congress has tried to fix our immigration system, promises of a more secure border are never upheld. And the bill we have in front of us today is following the same path as past immigration bills. Under this bill, it's certain that 12 million people in this country who are here illegally will receive legal status soon after the bill is enacted. However, the border security provisions of this bill are, again, nothing more than promises, which, again, may never be upheld. And I know that when I talk to the people that I represent in the state of South Dakota, one of the questions you get over and over again is, when is our federal government going to keep its promises when it comes to the issue of border security? And the second question is, why do we need more laws when we're not enforcing the laws that we currently have on the books? Mr. President, it's time that we follow through on promises of a more secure border. And actually, you have to go back to 1996, which is the first time when Congress spoke on this issue. At that time, Congress stipulated that we needed to have a double and even triple-layered fence system on the border. Well, you roll time forward into 2006, 10 years later, the Secure Fence Act. Congress again passed a law requiring a double-layered fence, this time indicating very specific locations totaling around 850 miles, even above the current 700-mile requirement. Mr. President, 80 United States senators voted for that bill. Let me repeat that. 80 United States senators, Republicans and Democrats, in a bipartisan way, voted in 2006 under the Secure Fence Act for 850 miles of double-layered fence. Well, you go again forward to 2008 as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act. Congress specified this time that not less than 700 miles of fencing would be required. And to date, of course, of this requirement, only about 40 miles of the double-layered fence has been completed. During debate on the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act in 2010, an amendment was offered to require the completion of at least 700 miles of reinforced fencing along the southwest border, and this time with a specific timeline or specific date in mind, December 31st of 2010. That amendment was agreed to here on the Senate floor there were 54 votes in favor of it, including 21 Democrats, 13 of whom are still here today. But, Mr. President, the fence has still not been completed. Now, the amendment that I've offered, amendment number 1197, simply requires that we implement current law, completing 350 miles of double-layered fencing prior to RPI status being granted. The completion of this section of the fence would be a tangible, visible demonstration that we are serious about this issue of border security. After RPI status is granted, the remaining 350 miles required by current law would have to be constructed during the 10-year period before registered provisional immigrants can apply for green cards. So 350 miles before RPI status, 350 miles after. I think it's a reasonable way of approaching this issue. Now, people have gotten up and said, well, you can't, this fence is old school. It's not the only answer, Mr. President. It requires a combination of technology and manpower and surveillance, but there is an important place for infrastructure to play in this. And a double-layered fence, which was called for by Congress first in 1996, again in 2006, again in 2008, which there was broad bipartisan support for here in the United States Senate, should be something that we follow through on. One of the other issues that's been raised is, well, there's not money to do this. Well, there is money appropriated in this bill. $6.5 billion is appropriated, $1.5 billion of which is dedicated to infrastructure. Well, if you look at what it would cost to build a double-layered fence, the estimates are about $3.2 million per mile. So the 350 miles that we call for before RPI status is granted would run you in the range of $1 billion, sufficient within the money already allocated in the bill. But my point, Mr. President, very simply is this. We have made promises and commitments to the American people over and over and over again in a bipartisan way here in the United States Senate, which have not been followed through on. Now, the senator from Alabama who offered an amendment like this, very similar to this at the Judiciary Committee markup, is here on the floor, been a leader in terms of trying to secure our borders, an issue that I think most Americans, before we deal with any other aspect or element of the immigration debate, believe ought to be addressed. And I would just simply ask him, and Mr. President, if I might through the chair, because do you think that building 40 miles out of a 700-mile requirement is keeping the promise that we've made to build a border fence that's adequate to deter illegal crossings? And secondly, doesn't infrastructure, such as a double-layered fence, enhance the effectiveness of border control agents and surveillance technologies along the border, recognizing, again, it's not the only answer. It is combined with, complemented by other forms of border security. But it is important, in my view, Mr. President, that we have a visible, tangible way in which we make it very clear that this is a deterrent to people coming to this country illegally. We want people to come here legally. We are a welcoming nation. We are a nation of immigrants, but we're a nation of laws, and we have got to enforce the laws. We have not been doing that, and we have not been keeping the promises that we made to the American people when it comes to border security, and more specifically when it comes to the building of the fence. And so I would ask my colleague through the chair from Alabama about his views on this and whether or not we have followed through on a level that is anywhere consistent with what we promised to the American people. And secondly, don't you think that this infrastructure component is an important element when it comes to the border security part of this debate on immigration reform?
Mr. President, I thank the senator from South Dakota. He's exactly correct. This is a failure of Congress and the administration. As soon as some discretion was given to the administration to not build a fence they quit building a fence, and very little we're so far behind what we promised the American people. And I remember being engaged, Senator Thune, in the debate in both of those years, 2006, 2008. We actually came up with funds. We funded sufficiently the fence construction that needed to be done. We told the American people we were going to do it. We were proud of ourselves. Actually, I remember giving a hard time to my colleagues because in 2006 we authorized the fence, but there was no money. So it was later we finally forced the money to be appropriated, because the issue was, you say you're for a fence, you go back home and say, I voted for fencing and barriers, and then you don't put up the money. So the money was even put up, and it still did not happen as required by law. And Senator Thune, I think you said it so clearly. That's why the American people are rightly concerned about amnesty first, with the promise of enforcement in the future. Even when we pass laws that plainly say a fence shall be built, we put up money to build that fence, and it doesn't happen in the future. So what we're asked to do with this legislation is to grant an amnesty immediately. That will happen. That's the one thing in this bill that will happen. But we need to ask ourselves, what are the American people telling us? And a recent poll showed by 4-to-1 margin, the American people said, we want to see the enforcement first. Then we'll talk about the amnesty. Do your enforcement first. And your question is, how will it work? Well, we have discussed that over the years. The greatest example of how it works is at San Diego. That area was in complete disarray, violence, crime, drugs, economic disaster zone. It was a very grim situation in San Diego, all kinds of illegality at the border. And they built a double-wide secure fence that across that entire area, illegality ended totally, virtually. Almost no illegality is continuing at that stretch of the border today. Crime was dramatically reduced. Economic growth occurred on both sides of the border, and it was highly successful. And so several things happened. First, you end the illegality with a good fence. And secondly, it reduces dramatically the number of Border Patrol officers needed to make sure that illegal crossings aren't occurring, because there's a forced multiplication of their ability, and so you can save a lot of money by having fewer people. And when people see a real secure fence, they decide it's not worth the attempt, so they don't even try to do that. And that reduces the stress on the Border Patrol, the number of deportations, number of people that have to be sent back, reduces cost and saves money in the long run, and really achieves what the American people have asked us, I think, to achieve. So, Senator Thune, I think your amendment is very reasonable. It's certainly puts us on a path to completing the kind of barriers that are necessary. And as you said, it comes nowhere close to saying there's a fence across the entire border. It would just be at the areas where it would be most effective.
Right. And I would just say, Mr. President, to my colleague from Alabama, and again thank him for his leadership on this issue, both past and present, that what we are talking about here is something that is a part of a solution. This isn't the totality. This isn't the entirety. People have come down here and said, well, you can't just build a fence. People will tunnel under it. They'll climb over it. Of course they will. But coupled with additional Border Patrol agents, coupled with surveillance, coupled with modern technologies, it is a composite solution, if you will. But it still very clearly is a deterrent. It is a visible, tangible message and deterrent that, we want people to come to this country legally. We want to discourage illegal immigration. The fence, I think, is part of the infrastructure component of that border security solution, and it's something that we've all made commitments on in the past. And I think it's very hard to ask people to vote for an immigration reform bill that includes the legalization component to it if we're not going to follow through on the promises that we've made, because the American people have heard this before. Promises, promises is something they've heard plenty of in the past when it comes to this issue. We have yet to follow through on this, with the exception of the 36 miles, as I mentioned, that's been built. But commitments were made in 1996 and requirements to do this in 2006. As you said, in 2008, the money was added. That was a 76-17 vote here in the United States Senate. 76 United States senators from both parties voted to fund this in 2008. And in 2006, 80 United States senators, including now President Obama, who at that time was a senator, now Vice President Biden, who at that time was a senator, and at that time Senator Hillary Clinton, all voted for the Secure Fence Act in 2006. So, again, I'm not suggesting for a minute that it is the only solution, the cure-all, the panacea that's going to address this issue. But I think it is something that is very, very real, very tangible, very visible. It is something that we have made a commitment on to the American people, and I think it's something that we ought to follow through on. And it certainly ought to be a requirement, a condition, if you will, in this legislation before some of these other elements come to pass. Because if it's not, it will never get done, as we've already seen, going back to 1996. And so I hope that Amendment 1197, when it's voted on this afternoon, that we will have the same strong bipartisan support that we've had in the past on this issue. And I hope, again, that as a senator from Alabama and I have pointed out, that we will follow through on a commitment that we've made to the American people and do something really meaningful on the issue of border security. And so, Mr. President, I would, with that, say to my colleague from Alabama that, again, I appreciate his strong voice on this issue, and I hope that he and I will be joined by many others today.
Well, Senator Thune, thank you for your leadership in offering a clear legislative proposal that will work. And it's my observation that things that get proposed around here that don't work often are passed. Things that will actually work are difficult to get passed. And I don't know if you realize, Senator Thune, that although the sponsors of the legislation have talked a good bit about fencing that might occur, having a report on fencing, what we do know is that it did not require fencing anywhere in the bill. But in case anybody had any doubt about that, Senator Leahy, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, offered an amendment that explicitly stated nothing in the bill shall require the construction of any fencing at the border. So despite what others have heard about this being the toughest bill ever, and it's going to do more for enforcement than we've ever had, it in fact weakens and almost guarantees we will not have additional fencing, which would certainly be a component in my mind of a stronger, tougher enforcement mechanism. And fencing barriers do, I believe, help the President, who should lead on this, who should say clearly to the world our border is secure, we're building fences, and do not come, and the number of people who would attempt to come would drop a lot if we made that clear statement. Thank you for your good work.
And I would just say in closing, Mr. President, again, that but in those areas where, as the senator from Alabama noted, it is most needed. And Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor, and I would ask when the time comes for support on Amendment 1197. Thanks.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, last week I previewed an amendment that I will be offering hopefully as early as this afternoon on the underlying immigration bill. This is an amendment which the Democratic Majority Leader and at least one or two other members of the Senate have called a poison pill. I find that somewhat bizarre, especially in light of what others have said about this amendment, which I'll talk about briefly. And it strikes me as unusual that any time anyone offers a different idea by way of an amendment that people don't like, they call it a poison pill, as if that was the only option. You either take it without the amendment or you accept the amendment and it kills the legislation. Well, we know the truth is far different. And in fact, several members of the so-called Gang of Eight that have been very much involved in negotiating the underlying bill have different opinions. which actually I find somewhat refreshing, but not all that surprising. Senator Flake, for example, from Arizona, said, I don't think it's a poison pill on June the 12th. Senator Rubio said of my results amendment, it's an excellent place to start. I'm grateful for their comments. And Senator Bennett, a senator from Colorado on the other side of the aisle, and Senator Flake argued that they aren't afraid of adding a requirement to nab 90% of would-be border crossers. That was at a Christian Science Monitor breakfast on June the 12th. Senator Bennett went on to say, I have every confidence that we're going to meet the mark well before the 10 years. He said that on the 12th as well. So the interesting thing about this discussion is the very same measurement or standard that's in my amendment actually comes from the bill that was introduced by the Gang of Eight. 100% situational awareness of the border and a 90% apprehension rate. All my amendment did is to say, okay, you set the standard, but we're going to make sure that the federal government actually keeps its promises, because unfortunately the history is littered, recent history in particular, with broken promises by the federal government, particularly when it comes to immigration. My amendment is necessary, my results amendment, which I'll describe further, is necessary because in its current form, the underlying bill does not include a genuine border security trigger. You don't have to take my word for it. Last week, the Assistant Democratic Leader, Senator Durbin of Illinois, himself said quite explicitly that while the original proposal, as he described it, in January 2013, he said a pathway to citizenship needs to be contingent upon securing the border. He said that in the context of the bipartisan framework for comprehensive immigration reform. But later on, he was quoted in a national journal on June the 11th saying the gang has delinked the pathway to citizenship and border enforcement. Well, the bill that's being sold today delinks the pathway to citizenship and border enforcement, and my amendment would reestablish the very same linkage that the gang themselves trumpeted in January 2013. So I think this is a remarkable admission that the current bill delinks the pathway to citizenship and border security. I think most members of the Senate believe that whatever we do in terms of the status of people who are currently here in undocumented status, that one thing we have to do is to make sure that we don't ever deal with this issue again by failing to deal sensibly, responsibly with border security and enforcement. So basically the approach of the proponents of the underlying bill as currently written before my amendment is trust us. Trust us. Well, I have to say that you don't have to be a pollster to know that there's not an awful lot of trust toward Washington and the Congress and the federal government. And it's easy to understand why, with all of the various scandals or things that have been represented one way that turn out to be another way. There is a trust deficit here in Washington, D.C. And for those of us who believe that doing nothing on immigration reform is not an option, what I would like to do is to do something to make things better, but in order to get there, we're going to have to guarantee that the border security and the interior enforcement provisions and the reestablishment of basic order to our broken immigration system is accomplished in this bill. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So in the words of Ronald Reagan, I think we should ask people to trust, but we should also verify that that trust is justified. I'm not sure some of my colleagues appreciate just how essential immigration reform or border security is to immigration reform. For the past 3 decades, the American people have been given one hollow promise after another about the federal government's commitment to secure our borders. The rhetoric from Washington has been impressive, but the results have been pathetic. The reality on the ground in Texas and in other border states has been quite different. Let me put it this way. A decade after the 9/11 terrorist attacks that killed 3,000 Americans in New York, the Department of Homeland Security has gained operational control of less than 45% of our southern border. 45%. Secretary of Homeland Security said the border's secure. The President said it's more secure than it's ever been. 45% secured. For that matter, it's been more than a decade since the 9/11 Commission recommended another important requirement that's contained in my amendment, which is a nationwide biometric entry-exit system. It's been 17 years since President Clinton signed legislation mandating such a system. So we wonder why there's been such a lack of confidence and a trust deficit between the American people and Washington when it comes to immigration reform and fixing our broken immigration system. It's because they've been sold one hollow promise after another. And yet we still don't have a biometric entry-exit system that President Clinton signed into law 17 years ago. Even though about half of illegal immigration occurs when people come into the country legally and overstay their visa and simply melt into the great American landscape. That's where 40% of our illegal immigration comes from. And we're asking the American people to trust us again? Mr. President, until Congress acknowledges our credibility problem when it comes to enforcing our immigration laws, including border security, and until such time as we take serious action to fix it, we're never going to get true immigration reform, and we will never be able to pat ourselves on the back and say, you know what, this is not going to happen again. My amendment goes beyond mere promises and platitudes. It demands results, and it creates a mechanism for ensuring them. Under my amendment, probationary immigrants are not eligible for legalization until after the U.S.-Mexico border has been secured and until after we have a nationwide biometric entry-exit system at all airports and seaports, and after we have a nationwide E-Verify, which allows employers to verify the eligibility of individuals who apply for jobs to work as legally in the country. Now, that is what a real border security trigger looks like, and that's why it's so important. Because we need to incentivize everybody who cares passionately about border security and restoring the rule of law to our broken immigration system, on one hand, and those who, on the other hand, who more than anything else want an opportunity for people to eventually become American citizens, even if they've entered the country illegally after they paid a fine and proceeded down a tough but fair path to citizenship. What we need to do is incentivize the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the entire bureaucracy to make sure that we guarantee that those will happen. And this is the only way I know of to do it. Unfortunately, many of our colleagues don't want a real trigger when it comes to border security. Above all, they want a pathway to citizenship, and I'm not convinced beyond that they have much concern for whether we keep our promises with regard to border security. They're hoping that once again, the American people will put their faith in empty promises. But the time for empty promises is over when it comes to our broken immigration system. If we're ever going to push immigration reform across the finish line, which I want to do, we need to guarantee results. and my amendment does that. I would contend, Mr. President, that rather than my amendment being the poison pill, the failure to pass a credible provision ensuring border security and interior enforcement, that will be the poison pill that causes immigration reform to die. That is not a result that I want. I want us to see a solution. I do not want the status quo, because the status quo is broken. It serves no one's best interest. So I'm just amazed at some of my colleagues who are resisting this amendment. Why won't they take yes for an answer? Why won't they take yes for an answer on something that unites Republicans and Democrats who are actually desperately interested in finding a solution and believe the status quo is simply unacceptable? As I've repeatedly emphasized, my amendment simply uses the same border security standards as the underlying Gang of Eight bill. They're the ones that came up with the standard for 100% situational awareness. They're the ones who came up with a 90% apprehension rate, but their bill reiterates a promise but guarantees no results. We've had 27 years of input since the 1986 amnesty, and we still don't have secure borders. And now it's beyond time to guarantee not just more promises or inputs, but real outputs. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent for an additional 2 minutes.
Without objection.